David Reynolds had always been the kind of man who prided himself on having his life together. At 33 years old, he was a successful real estate agent, a well-known figure in the Seattle area, with a career that allowed him to enjoy the finer things in life. He was known for being calm, collected, and above all, responsible. Friends often referred to him as the one with the perfect plan. A man whose life was carefully structured, with every decision calculated for success. David had grown up in a conservative household. His father, a military man, had instilled in him strong values about hard work, respect, and family. His mother was a stay-at-home mom who taught him the importance of stability and loyalty. These values shaped David into the man he had become, someone who sought a life partner who shared the same sense of commitment, values, and honesty. And then he met Jessica Porter. Jessica was everything David had dreamed of in a woman. At 29 years old, she was independent, successful, and utterly captivating. She owned a chic little boutique in downtown Seattle, where she sold high-end fashion to an elite clientele. Jessica was the kind of woman who could command attention when she walked into a room. Tall, with striking blue eyes and long dark hair, she had an effortless beauty that drew people to her. But it wasn't just her appearance that captured David's heart. It was her charisma, her charm, and the way she seemed to understand him like no one else ever had. They met at a charity gala hosted by mutual friends. It was an event filled with Seattle's elite, businessmen, socialites, and influencers. But the moment David laid eyes on Jessica, the rest of the room faded into the background. Their conversation flowed naturally that evening, and by the end of the night, they both felt a spark. David couldn't stop thinking about her after that. He called her the very next day, and they began dating almost immediately. Their relationship moved fast. Within a few months, David was introducing Jessica to his close-knit group of friends and his family. Everyone adored her. His mother, who was often critical of the women David dated, took an instant liking to Jessica. His friends, too, were impressed by her intelligence and wit. Jessica fit seamlessly into David's world. By the time their one-year anniversary came around, David was sure of one thing. Jessica was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. He proposed to her during a weekend getaway to a luxury resort in Napa Valley. Jessica, with tears in her eyes, said yes, and they began planning their future together. The wedding was a grand affair, held at one of Seattle's most historic churches. It was a day that David would never forget. As he stood at the altar, watching Jessica walk down the aisle in a stunning lace gown, he couldn't believe his luck. She looked radiant, and all he could think was how lucky he was to have found such a perfect woman to share his life with. But even on that day, there were small, fleeting moments of unease. As David placed a ring on Jessica's finger, he noticed her hand trembling slightly. Her smile, though radiant, seemed to falter at times. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just wedding day nerves. After all, everyone got nervous on their wedding day, right? Their honeymoon in the Caribbean was as luxurious as it was romantic. David spared no expense. 2 weeks of paradise. White sand beaches, crystal clear waters, and lavish candlelit dinners by the ocean. It was supposed to be the beginning of their happily ever after. But even in paradise, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jessica seemed distant at times, lost in her thoughts. She would often sit on the beach, staring out at the horizon, her face a mask of worry. When David asked her what was wrong, she always brushed it off. "I'm just tired," she would say with a soft smile. "Don't worry about me." But David did worry. He loved Jessica deeply, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. It was in the small things. The way she would suddenly withdraw from conversations, the way her phone was always locked, and how she would spend hours on it. texting people David didn't know. After they returned from their honeymoon, life resumed as usual, or so David tried to convince himself. They moved into their beautiful new home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood just outside of Seattle. David continued to work in real estate, closing deals and expanding his business, while Jessica focused on her boutique. But the sense of unease only grew stronger. Jessica began coming home late, often with vague excuses about work or meeting friends. David tried to be understanding. He knew how stressful running a business could be, but something didn't feel right. He started noticing other changes in her behavior. Jessica became more secretive, locking her phone whenever David was around and taking hush phone calls in the middle of the night. He didn't want to be the paranoid husband, but his gut told him something was wrong. He had always trusted Jessica implicitly, but now, for the first time, he found himself doubting her. As the months went by, the cracks in their marriage became more apparent. Intimacy between them had dwindled. When they were together, it felt forced, as if Jessica was somewhere else mentally. She would turn away from him after they made love, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. David would try to engage her in conversation, but she would always respond with vague answers. David's friends began to notice the strain. "Is everything okay with you and Jessica?" One of his closest friends, Mike, asked him over drinks one evening. David shrugged it off. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. But everything was not fine. David's suspicions grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica was hiding something from him. He started noticing more things, small, subtle changes in her behavior. She became more withdrawn, her smile less frequent. There were times when David would wake up in the middle of the night to find Jessica sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, her face illuminated by the flickering light. When he asked her what was wrong, she would always say the same thing: "I'm fine, just stressed." But David knew it was more than stress. There was something Jessica wasn't telling him, and it was eating away at him. It was a cold, rainy evening in November when David's world finally came crashing down. Jessica had gone out with friends. At least, that's what she told him. But something about her excuse didn't sit right with David. He had never been the kind of man to invade someone's privacy, but tonight was different. His suspicions had grown too loud to ignore. While Jessica was out, David decided to search through her things. He knew it was wrong, but he needed answers. He started in the bedroom, rifling through her drawers, searching for anything that might explain the growing distance between them. But it wasn't until he opened the closet that he found it. Hidden beneath a pile of old clothes was a small, locked box. David's heart pounded as he picked it up. His hand shook as he pried the lock open with a small screwdriver. Inside, he found something that would change his life forever. There, among old documents and photographs, was Jessica's birth certificate. But the name on it wasn't Jessica Porter. It was Jacob Porter. David felt the world spin. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Jessica had been born male. She had transitioned, and she had kept this part of her life hidden from him. She had never told him the truth. For a moment, David stood frozen, unable to breathe. His mind flooded with questions. How long had she kept this from him? Why hadn't she told him? Why had she lied about something so fundamental? His love, his trust, everything he had built with Jessica felt like a lie. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had married, had been hiding a secret so deep, so life-altering, that it shattered the very foundation of their relationship. When Jessica came home later that night, she was greeted by a sight she never expected. David was sitting on the edge of their bed, holding the birth certificate in his trembling hands. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief and anger. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice shaking with rage. Jessica froze in the doorway, her eyes locking onto the documents in David's hand. She had always feared this day would come, but she hadn't been ready for it, hadn't prepared for the fallout. "David, I can explain," Jessica began, her voice trembling. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." David stood up, his face contorted with anger. "You tricked me into marrying you. How could you do this to me?" Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, but she tried to remain composed. "I didn't want to lose you," she said softly. "I didn't want you to see me differently. I love you, David. This doesn't change who I am." But for David, it changed everything. His trust in Jessica, his love for her, it had all been built on a lie. He couldn't see past the betrayal. "You should have told me," David said, his voice rising with anger. "I had a right to know who I was marrying." Jessica's tears flowed freely now. "I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. I thought you would leave me. I didn't mean to deceive you." But her words fell on deaf ears. David's anger had already consumed him. He couldn't think straight. All he felt was the weight of the betrayal, the burning anger that threatened to overtake him. "I don't even know who you are anymore," David muttered, his voice cold and distant. Jessica took a step toward him, her eyes pleading. "I'm still the same person you fell in love with. Please, David, let's talk about this." But David couldn't hear her anymore. The trust that had once bound them together was gone, replaced by a rage that consumed every rational thought. Days passed, and the tension in their home grew unbearable. David couldn't look at Jessica without feeling a surge of anger and betrayal. He began drinking heavily, trying to numb the pain of what he had discovered. Jessica, for her part, tried to reason with him. She wanted to make him understand that she hadn't meant to hurt him, but David wouldn't listen. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Jessica decided she had to leave. She couldn't stay in the house with David's growing anger looming over her. She began packing a bag, tears streaming down her face. She loved David, but she knew that their marriage was falling apart, and for her safety, she needed to leave. But David wasn't ready to let her go. He stormed into the bedroom, his face flushed with anger. Jessica froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "David, please," she begged. "Let's just calm down. We can talk about this." But David wasn't hearing her anymore. His rage had taken over, blinding him to everything else. "You're not leaving," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Jessica backed away, her eyes wide with fear. She had never seen David like this before. "David, please." Without thinking, David grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it with all his might. Jessica screamed as the lamp came crashing down on her head. The force of the blow sent her crumpling to the floor, blood pooling around her. David stood over her, panting, the lamp still clenched in his trembling hands. For a moment, everything was silent. The realization of what he had just done hit him like a ton of bricks. He dropped the lamp, falling to his knees beside her. "Jessica," his voice broke as he reached out to touch her, but she was already gone. David sat in the deafening silence of their once warm home, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He knelt beside Jessica's lifeless body, her blood staining the wooden floor beneath them. The woman he had once adored, the woman he had vowed to love for the rest of his life, lay motionless at his feet, her face still, her eyes closed forever. He stared at her, unable to comprehend the enormity of what he had done. His hands, still trembling, were covered in her blood. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening as the reality of the situation set in. He had killed her. In a moment of rage, fueled by a deep sense of betrayal, he had taken her life. For what felt like hours, David remained frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. His mind replayed the events over and over again. The discovery, the confrontation, the anger that had boiled over, and the final, terrible act of violence. It all felt like a nightmare, one from which he couldn't wake. The house was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Time had lost all meaning. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there, staring at the body of the woman he had once loved more than anything in the world. He felt detached, as if he were floating outside of himself, watching the scene unfold from a distance. And then, slowly, reality crept back in. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his trance. He fumbled for it, his hand shaking so badly that he almost dropped it. It was a message from a friend. Something mundane, something about meeting up for drinks later that week. The normalcy of it was jarring, almost mocking. How could the world outside continue turning when his head just collapsed? He stared at the phone for a long moment before it slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. He knew what he had to do, but his body refused to move. His mind raced with the possibilities. He could run, he could try to cover it up, or he could face the consequences of his actions. But none of those options felt real. In the end, the weight of his guilt was too heavy to bear. With trembling hands, David picked up the phone again and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, professional. 911. What is your emergency? For a moment, David couldn't speak. His throat was dry, his voice caught in his chest. When he finally managed to get the words out, they were barely above a whisper. I killed her, he said, his voice hollow. I killed my wife. The operator asked him to stay on the line, to explain what had happened, but David barely heard her. His mind was numb, his body on autopilot as he followed her instructions. He gave his address, his voice trembling, and waited for the police to arrive. When the officers entered the house, they found David sitting on the floor beside Jessica's lifeless body, staring blankly at the wall. He made no attempt to resist as they placed him in handcuffs and led him out of the house. His mind was a fog, the world around him a blurred as they led him into the back of the police car. David caught a glimpse of the neighbors standing outside, their faces pale with shock and horror. Blue and red lights flashed, casting an eerie glow over the quiet suburban street. The whispers of the crowd filled the air, but David barely registered them. His thoughts were consumed by one thing, what he had done, and what would happen next. The news of Jessica's murder spread like wildfire through the Seattle community, and soon it reached national headlines. The case was too shocking, too gruesome, not to catch the public's attention. A seemingly perfect marriage, a devastating secret, and a brutal murder, all the ingredients for a media frenzy. Reporters swarmed the quiet neighborhood where the crime had taken place, their cameras trained on the house that had once been a symbol of love and new beginnings. Neighbors, who had once exchanged friendly waves with David and Jessica, now stood in disbelief, giving interviews about the couple who had seemed so happy, so in love. It's hard to believe, one neighbor told a local news station. They always seemed like the perfect couple. I never would have thought something like this could happen. Another neighbor added, Jessica was such a sweet woman. I can't imagine what could have driven David to do something so horrible. But as the details of the case began to emerge, the story became even more sensational. It wasn't just a murder. It was a murder fueled by the discovery of Jessica's hidden past. The revelation that Jessica had been born male, that she had undergone gender transition, and kept it a secret from David, became the focal point of the media's coverage. Newspapers, television stations, and online news outlets all seized on the story, with headlines like "Husband Murders Wife After Discovering She Was Transgender" and "Betrayed Husband's Rage Leads to Brutal Murder." The public, too, became captivated by the case, and debates raged online about gender identity, secrecy, and the boundaries of trust in relationships. Some people painted David as a victim, a man who had been deceived and whose fragile sense of masculinity had been shattered by the discovery of his wife's secret. Others, however, saw him as a monster, a man whose insecurities and violent tendencies had led him to commit an unspeakable act of violence. As the days passed, the story grew more complex. Friends and family members of both David and Jessica came forward to give their accounts of the couple's relationship. David's friends described him as a calm, rational man, someone who was deeply committed to his work and his family. They expressed shock at the idea that he could have committed such a brutal crime. Jessica's friends, on the other hand, painted a picture of a woman who had lived in fear of her secret being discovered. One of Jessica's closest friends, Lila, gave a tearful interview in which she described how Jessica had always been afraid that her past would catch up with her. She loved David so much, Lila said, her voice cracking with emotion. She didn't want to lose him. She thought he would leave her if he knew the truth. That's why she kept it a secret. She wasn't trying to deceive him. She was just afraid. The trial of David Reynolds became one of the most highly publicized murder trials in recent memory. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public eager to hear the details of the case. It seemed like the entire nation was watching, waiting to see how the story would unfold. David's defense team knew that the key to their case was framing him as a man who had been pushed to the brink by the discovery of Jessica's secret. They argued that David's actions had been driven by emotional distress, that the shock of learning about Jessica's past had sent him into a state of uncontrollable rage. They painted a picture of a man who had been deeply in love with his wife, only to have his entire world shattered by a revelation he couldn't handle. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They presented David as a cold-blooded killer, a man whose fragile masculinity had led him to commit a horrific act of violence. They argued that Jessica's past was irrelevant, that what mattered was the fact that David had taken her life in a fit of rage, and that he had brutally beaten and killed her in their own home. The prosecution brought forth evidence that painted a gruesome picture of the crime. Photos of the crime scene were shown to the jury, photos that depicted the blood-soaked floor, the broken lamp that had been used as a weapon, and Jessica's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. The images were so graphic that some members of the jury had to look away. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment of the trial came when Jessica's mother took the stand. She was a small, frail woman, her face etched with grief as she recounted the day she found out about her daughter's death. Her voice shook as she described how Jessica had always worried about telling David the truth, but how she had hoped that he would accept her for who she was. She just wanted to be loved, Jessica's mother said, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to live her life without fear. But instead, she was murdered by the man she thought would love her no matter what. David sat in the courtroom, his face pale and emotionless, as Jessica's mother spoke. He had shown little reaction throughout the trial, his eyes often downcast, his hands clasped tightly together. But as Jessica's mother described her daughter's hopes and fears, David's expression faltered, and for a brief moment, he seemed to crumble under the weight of his actions. The trial lasted for several weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments and calling witnesses to testify. The media continued to cover every moment of the proceedings, and the public remained deeply divided. Some people sympathized with David, believing that he had been driven to the edge by a devastating betrayal. Others saw him as nothing more than a violent man who had committed an unforgivable crime. In the end, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. David showed little reaction as the sentence was read. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even after the trial, the case continued to spark debates across the country. Jessica's death became a rallying cry for the transgender community, highlighting the dangers they face in a world that often refused to accept them. Advocates for transgender rights pointed to Jessica's murder as yet another example of the violence and discrimination that transgender people, particularly transgender women of color, faced on a daily basis. The hashtag Justice for Jessica began trending on social media, with thousands of people calling for greater protections for transgender individuals and an end to the violence that plagued their community. Activists organized rallies and protests, demanding that lawmakers take action to address the alarming rates of violence against transgender people. Jessica's friends and supporters spoke out about the challenges she had faced, both in her personal life and in society at large. They described how she had always been afraid of being rejected, of being judged for who she was. And while some people criticized Jessica for not being upfront with David about her past, others argued that her decision to keep her secret was a reflection of the fear and stigma that transgender people often faced. David's family, too, struggled to come to terms with what had happened. His parents, who had always been proud of their son's accomplishments, were devastated by the news of his crime. They gave few interviews, choosing to grieve in private, but in the few statements they did make, they expressed shock and sorrow at what had happened. "We never thought David was capable of something like this," his father said in one interview. "He was always such a calm, level-headed man. We don't understand how things could have gone so wrong." In the months following the trial, the house where Jessica had been murdered was eventually sold, but the neighbors said it never felt the same. The horrific events had left a scar on the community, one that would take years to heal. The tragic story of David and Jessica is a chilling reminder of the destructive power of secrets, the dangers of unchecked rage, and the societal pressures that can tear lives apart. It's not just a story about murder. It's a story about identity, trust, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves from a world that often refuses to understand them. Jessica's life was cut short not because she wasn't brave, but because the world wasn't ready to accept her. David's uncontrollable rage is a stark reminder of the dangers that arise when identity, masculinity, and betrayal collide in tragic ways. As we reflect on this case, it's important to remember the real-life consequences of secrecy, stigma, and societal pressures. Lives are lost, families are torn apart, and communities are forever changed. If you found this story as heartbreaking and eye-opening as we did, please consider supporting True Crime Stories Unfold. Hit that like button, share this story with others, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime tales. Your support helps us continue to share these important stories with the world. Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, truth is often stranger and far more tragic than fiction.